Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is California's pioneering policies for new homes, greater efficiency with required solar energy. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, and we have with us our host for this webinar, Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of CESA. We also have with us some excellent guest speakers from the California Energy Commission. Before I pass it over to all of them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. Everyone joining us for this webinar today, you all join in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can connect using your computer, mic, and speakers, or you can call in using telephone. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the little orange arrow that you see circled here. You can also use that arrow to expand the webinar console if you'd like to view it. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions and your comments throughout the webinar as you think of them by typing them into the question box on the webinar console and hitting send. We will be saving about 20-25 minutes at the end of the presentations for a Q&A with the audience, and we will get to as many questions as we can. We do expect to have a lot of people on the line today, and that means probably also a lot of questions. So to make sure that we get to your question, type it in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end to submit your question. But of course, you can also type questions in at the end. A final note for you, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email within about 24-48 hours, probably sometime this afternoon, with a link to the webinar slides as a PDF and a webinar recording. And we'll also be posting those webinar materials on the CESA website. And this says the members only section, but that is not true. Sorry about that. It will be on the public section of the CESA website at cesa.org/webinars. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to our host for this webinar, Warren Leon. As I mentioned, Warren is the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance.
Hey, thanks very much, Samantha. I'm going to introduce the webinar in a minute, but I want to make sure you first know what the Clean Energy States Alliance, or CESA, is. We're a national membership organization composed of leading energy agencies across the country, most of them state energy agencies. You can see all the logos here. The California Energy Commission, who we'll be hearing from today, is one of our members, but we do a wide range of activities to share information and ideas among the states, to then take that information from the states and share it with a wider audience of stakeholders interested in clean energy. And we do a lot of webinars and other things like that. So go to our website, cesa.org, to learn about our organization. If we can go to the next slide. Well, you know, we've been really looking forward to this webinar today, because there's a lot been going on in California in recent months and even over the past couple of weeks. And there are a lot happening there that is relevant to other states, and other states can learn from what California has been doing in a pioneering way. And we're going to be learning about California's efforts relating to building energy efficiency standards and to the inclusion of solar in buildings in the state. And to tell us about it, we have as our main speaker today, Mazi Shirak. He's joined by a number of his colleagues who will be available during the question period to help answer your questions, and we'll introduce them later. But let me first introduce you to Mazi. He's a key staff member at the California Energy Commission. He's a mechanical engineer and was the Zero Net Energy lead for the 2019 cycle of the Building Energy Efficiency Standards. Previously, he was the project manager for the 2008, the 2013, and the 2016 cycle of the standards. He worked with California's major utilities and with a large team of consultants to make the building envelope and systems in buildings as efficient as possible, and then to require appropriate PV sizes in order to achieve the goal of zero net energy in buildings. With that by way of introduction, let me turn it over to Mazi, who's going to tell us about what they did, why they did it, and explain a little bit more about their programs there in terms of new solar homes and building efficiency.
Thank you, Warren, for that introduction. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Mazi Shirak, and as Warren said, I'm the lead for Zero Net Energy for the Commission, and also I act as an advisor to the entire Building Standards team here. In the room, I have with me Bill Pennington, who's also a senior advisor to the Building Standards. And Bill, do you want to give a brief introduction?
Hi, Bill Pennington. I've been working on building standards here at the Energy Commission for about 30 years. Managed the cycles over and over and over again. Worked closely with Mazi to develop the policy goals and approaches for achieving a lot of energy efficiency in these buildings, plus solar starting in 2019.
Thank you. I also have Danny Tam. Danny.
Hi, I'm the water heating lead for Title 24, and I also assist Mazi on D&E topics.
And I also have two staff from our new Solar Home Partnership programs. Brief introductions, please.
Hi, my name is Kevin. I work with the New Solar Home Partnership.
And hi, my name is O'Shea Bennett. I also work in the New Solar Homes Partnership Division here at the Energy Commission for solar incentives.
So I will be making the presentation, which is going to take about 40 to 45 minutes. But when it comes to question and answer, other staff are going to help me respond to some of these questions. As you may know, the Energy Commission adopted, I'm trying to advance, okay. Sorry, there's a delay here. So back in the May of 2018, the Energy Commission adopted the 2019 Building Energy Efficiency Standards, which is going to go into effect on January 1, 2019. We set ourselves 6 goals when this process started, and I'm happy to report that we think we can achieve all 6 of those. And so the first one is to increase building energy efficiency as cost effectively as possible, and we'll talk about some of the specific measures a little bit later on. The other goal is to contribute to states' GHG reduction goals, and I have some slides on that. We wanted to substantially reduce the home's impact on the grid through both energy efficiency and photovoltaics, and also couple those with what we call grid harmonization strategies. That harmonizes the building and its load more effectively with the grid than without. We also provided an independent compliance path for both mixed fuel homes and all electric homes. Even though a majority of the buildings being built in the state are mixed fuel, all electric homes actually provide a cleaner path to zero carbon. So we wanted to encourage that practice. We also provide the tools and the means for what we call Part 11 or the REACH code or the stretch codes, so the local jurisdictions can adopt more aggressive goals than the base standards. And we've also developed the tools to enable compliance with building standards, efficiency standards, the photovoltaic requirements, the battery storage requirements, and also to allow local jurisdictions to have more aggressive REACH codes. And we'll talk about those tools a little bit later on. So the effort for Z&E started I would say exactly about 10 years ago, 2008. And as you can see, there was a series of policy directives by the governor and also by other agencies, the California Public Utilities Commission, the CPUC, CARB, which is the California Air Resources Board, and the Energy Commission, and which outlined the desire for buildings in the state, the residential buildings, to be zero net energy by 2020, and for non-residential buildings by 2030. We had a change in governor in 2010, and our current governor, Brown, was also supported these goals. But prior to zero net energy, there were other efforts in the state which actually set the stage for Z&E, and I like to recognize that. For instance, the SB1 by Murray in 2006, that set the goals of having 3,000 megawatts of installed distributed generation and solar PV capacity in the state. Also wanted to encourage the self-sufficient solar industry and having the solar PV installed on at least 50% of new homes. And there were 3 programs that came out of that. One of them was the New Solar Home Partnership and the NSHP, and also the CPUC's California Solar Initiative. There were also opportunities for locally or publicly owned utilities to develop their own programs that encourage PV installation in the buildings. The goals were to have a sustainable solar home market and encourage builders' commitment to install solar PVs on their homes, having high-performing solar systems on very efficient buildings, which is what actually the Z&E goal is, and also achieving at least 360 megawatts of installed solar power electricity in California. Additionally, solar in at least 50% of new homes, and again, to have a self-sufficient solar industry. And so this program is actually winding down, and there's a brief summary here. And we think this has been a huge success. We've had more than 75 builders participate in this program, more than 30 retailers and installers. And so far, about 114,000 systems have been installed in the state with an installed capacity of about 415 megawatts, which exceeds the 300 megawatts that was originally set. And almost had $353 million has been given in incentives. So this NSHP and what we just described here, that set the stage for Z&E. So as we mentioned, the Z&E goal was formulated back in 2008, and at the time, this was a kind of a simple goal or strategy, and the requirement was to have a building that's very efficient, the building envelope and the appliances and all the equipment that's working in it, and then having some amount of renewables that will offset the annual energy consumption of that home using the time-dependent valuation as its currency or the metric. And the original goal of offsetting the entire energy included both electricity and natural gas. However, things always turn out to be more complicated than people first envisioned, and that's also true with Z&E. So a lot of lessons have been learned in the intervening 10 years, and there's also been a lot of new developments which will influence how we approach the Z&E goal. I have listed a few of them here. For instance, California has the goal of having 50% of its electricity grid sources come from renewable sources by 2030. This slide may be outdated because we're on the threshold of changing this requirement to 60% by 2030 and 100% by 2045. You know, time will tell. But, nonetheless, large utility scale installation of PV system does have an impact on how we approach Z&E. We also have the emergence of net energy metering rules, the NEM rules, and these are evolving. And as they evolve, they will influence the Z&E goal. We also have the emergence of time of use, or TOU, compensation rents for homeowners, which also influences how we approach the Z&E. One of the issues is that the current NEM rules, they treat the grid as if the grid is this vast virtual storage where you can store or bank kilowatt hours during part of the day or part of the year and then use it later on. But we know, in fact, even the grid in California and perhaps elsewhere has very little storage capacity. So that's also one thing we need to keep in mind. So therefore, out of that comes this idea of grid harmonization. So if we are going to add substantial new solar resources on buildings, both residential, non-residential, we need to do it in a way that it actually helps the grid. And so the idea of grid harmonization comes in. So the definition for grid harmonization is that these are measures and strategies that harmonize customer-owned distributed energy resources assets with the grid to maximize self-utilization of the PV array output and limit grid exports to the periods beneficial to the grid and the ratepayers. In plain English, these are strategies that will allow the homeowner to use the kilowatt hours that generated by the PV on site to serve the loads of the house and not send it back to the grid. And if it does so, it only do it in a way that will maximize benefits to the grid and the environment and the occupants. So some examples of grid harmonization strategies would be PVs in combination with battery storage, demand response measure, thermal storage, and in the future we think electric vehicles will also play a role in this. You probably have seen versions of this curve, the duck curve. We call this one the bad duck. And reason for this is actually a CalISO graph of about a year or so ago. And what this shows is the overabundance of solar energy in the middle of the day to the point that we may have too much solar PV. In some cases, we have to give this additional kilowatt hours to neighboring states. So that's one point. But the other point is that CalISO has identified some solutions. The first two, targeting energy efficiency and increasing storage and demand response, are exactly what we're doing through the building standards. So the purpose of this graph here is to show what would happen if you add grid harmonization strategies to rooftop PV system. This is a 2,700 square foot home here in Sacramento, California. This is on August 6th, and typical August 6th in the States. And what you see here are two graphs. One is the red and one is the blue. And the difference is that the red graph here is a very efficient 2019 compliant building with about 3 kilowatt PV system only. And when you look at that graph, it looks a lot like that duck curve that I just showed previously. So now we take the same house and we add about 14 kilowatt hour battery storage to it. And the result is the blue curve. And as you can see that the blue curve is hugging the zero line for about 20 hours out of the 24 hours. And about 4 hours, the house is actually discharging into the grid. So again, while without the grid harmonization, we're actually following the dot curve. With grid harmonization, this house is actually largely invisible to the grid. So that's where the idea of grid harmonization comes in. So based on all that, we developed this approach for the 2019 standards. First, envelope efficiency. We've been working on new concepts that are called high-performance attics and high-performance walls for the last 3 code cycles, probably since 2013. And these are our effort to reduce the heating and cooling loads in the building significantly. And we are seeing a lot of success with this concept in the state now. More and more builders are embracing high-performance attic and high-performance wall concepts. In addition to that, we have lowered the U factor for the windows and the SHGC to 0.30 U factor and 0.23 SHGC. And additionally, we have made quality insulation installation a prescriptive measure. And this is a measure that ensures that insulation is that once installed, it actually performs the way it's supposed to. There are no gaps, there's no missing pieces, there's no compression, and so forth. Number 2 is an appropriately sized, or what we call right-sized PV system. Talk about that in a minute, what a right-sized PV system means. You mentioned before, leveling the playing field for all electric homes, and also having grid harmonization strategies. One of the rules in Title 24 is that any measure that we include into the standards, whether it's energy efficiency or PV system, must be cost effective from the homeowner's perspective using life cycle costing analysis, which is a net present value approach. Using NEM rules, the current NEM rule in California states that the PV system cannot produce more kilowatt hours than the house uses in 1 year. So if you oversize your PV system, let's say your house load is 4,000 kilowatt hours, but you generate 6,000, so you have an overgeneration of 2,000 kilowatt hours. You're only going to get 3 cents a kilowatt hours for that overgeneration. So that makes that overgeneration very uneconomic. So the most economic scenario from NEM perspective is a PV system that offsets the annual kilowatt hours consumption of the house. And that is the criteria that we use, and that's what we call, when we use the term right sizing, that's what we mean. It's a PV system that offsets the annual kilowatt hours. And what we found was this approach is cost effective in all 16 of our climate zones. So based on all this, for the first time, the 2019 standards, I think anywhere on the planet, included prescriptive solar PV requirements that are sized to displace the annual electricity load of the house. We did include several exceptions. One is a shading due to external barriers. If a house is being built inside within a city, there are adjacent buildings, there's hills, or there are big trees and all that, shading the roofs, so there's an exception for that. We also have an exception for buildings that whose master plan were approved prior to the effective date of the building standards. If those master plans are approved and somehow the roof lines are not conducive to having PV system, we have some provisions, for them to comply with the standards without installing the full PV that may be required. Same thing for multi-story buildings. If you have 2- or 3-story buildings, you may have limited roof area, so we have variances for those. The other thing that is important in the standards is that for us to provide options to the builders, whether it's energy efficiency measures or renewable systems such as PV requirements. So while most of the attention is on rooftop PV systems that are purchased, there are actually other options available. So again, one option would be outright purchase, and this typically will result in a larger upfront investment, but it also has the benefit of having the greatest savings for the homeowner. We estimate that, the outright PV system will increase the mortgage by about $40 to $45, but it will reduce the utility cost by about $80. So there's almost like a 2-to-1 benefit to cost ratio. However, if first cost is of a concern, there's also leased and PPA, power purchase agreement options. These typically have little or no upfront cost, and most of them offer an immediate 20% electricity cost reduction. So that there is an option that people can use. And we think in the future, community solar may be an option if and when approved by the Energy Commission. There's a lot of interest in this. And we have some municipal utilities in the state who may be proposing some plans along our requirements. So again, a little deeper into community solar. In section 10-115, we have the requirements for what community solar plans must do in order to get approval from the Energy Commission. And if and when they're approved, they can be used as an alternative to rooftop systems. However, they have to meet certain criteria. For one thing, even though we call this a community solar resource, if it's a utility or a large aggregator, they can actually use any renewable resource, such as wind or geothermal, along with solar. So it's not just solar, it's all renewables. As far as energy performance, these systems must perform as if they were a rooftop system. So, if you have a 3 kilowatt rooftop system that gives you 4,000 or 5,000 kilowatt hours, the community solar must actually mimic that performance. The community solar resources must be dedicated to the building for 20 years and not the occupant. So if the original owner moves, the benefit stays back with the building as if it was a rooftop system. Cost savings, the community solar options cannot cost the occupants more than non-participants. That's actually one of the problems with most of our community solar programs right now, that they offer the occupant a community solar program, but there's a surcharge on it. So to comply with the standards, that cannot be the case. It cannot cost more than what a non-participant would cost. And again, durability, as you mentioned, has to be dedicated to the building for 20 years. And additionality, this is very important that, if solar resource is dedicated to a home, it is dedicated to the home for that 20 years. There cannot be any double counting in that. We've also developed two very important documents, Joint Appendix 11 and 12. We call them for short JA11 and 12. Very important, a lot of detail here. I didn't present them all in here, but I do have links to all of these documents at the end of this presentation, and you should download and study these appendices on your own. JA11 has the qualification requirements for photovoltaic system. The two of more important aspects are the PV system must meet orientation and shading requirements. We're trying to keep the PV system as close to south and west as possible, because that's when the grid needs those PV electrons. If you have a PV system that's faced due east at 9, 10 o'clock in the morning, there's really not that much need for those electrons. And the other one is that the PV system must provide a lifetime web and mobile-based monitoring capabilities. This will allow the homeowners to monitor the performance of their own systems, and they will probably, once they notice there's something wrong, they can report that to the right people to take corrective action. JA12 has the qualification requirements for battery storage system. I should also pause to notice that even though we talk about battery storage system here, there are not a requirement in the standards. PV systems are a requirement. Battery storage systems are a compliance option. They can use that to buy additional credit, but it is not a requirement in the standards. However, we've been advised by the builders and others that there will be a big demand for storage systems to be installed in homes. So having said that, we wanted to have battery storage systems that actually works with the grid to advantage the homeowner and the grid and the environment and not work against them. Up to this point, vast majority of the battery storage systems that have been installed in the system are for backup power only, and a battery storage system that's in backup power brings absolutely no value to the grid or even the homeowner. In fact, because of the round-trip charge-discharge losses, you end up in some energy loss. So the only way the battery storage system can bring these benefits to the system is by meeting the requirements in JA12. And this is a requirement that turns this battery into a dynamic device that when it's coupled to the PV system, it can bring cost benefit to the homeowner. It works with time of use rate schedules. It works with the grid during the congestion, can discharging this grid to help the utilities. And it also includes 3 control strategies: the basic, the TOU, and the advanced demand response control. And in the future, we can actually add more control strategies as they become available. We also developed a new metric for compliance, what we call an energy design rating, or EDR. And what EDR does, it uses a reference building, which in this case we have aligned with ResNet, and we use a ResNet reference home, which is a 2006 IACC compliant home. And if you build a building that performs as good or as bad as the 2006 IACC, you get an EDR score of 100. So Z&E by definition is an EDR score of 0, which is down here. The 2019 standards, without the PV system, the EDR scores are around 40. It's kind of right around here, between 41 and 48. If we add the PV system, the EDR score is in the 20s. Here it says 15 to 27, but most of them are between 20 and 25. So we're not getting to the full Z&E with the 2019 standards. We're stopping at 20 to 25. Again, the reason for that is that we're not offsetting natural gas with PV system. It absolutely made no sense to do that. We've developed a software tool. We call that the CBEC Res, that has the capacity to calculate EDRs for both energy efficiency and the PV system. And one of the reasons why we use the EDR approach, because it provides the ultimate flexibility for the builders to achieve compliance. For instance, we set the target of EDR, let's say 22 or 23 in a given climate zone. The builder can get to that score any way they want. And they can use a combination of more energy efficiency, a building envelope, appliance efficiency, storage, demand response, and other strategies to get to that EDR. And this is exactly what the builders are doing now. They're all developing a package that's their preferred package. Different types of high-performance attics, different types of high-performance walls. They can use more efficient windows. Triple-pane windows are around the corner. They can be using that. So the builders actually really love this EDR approach because it gives them those flexibilities. This screenshot is one of the screenshots I've included here to demonstrate what our performance software can do. As you can see here, there are several tabs. This is an output screen. We have CO2 tabs. We have energy tabs. The CO2 tabs will show the implications of energy efficiency and renewable resources, their implications for CO2 emissions for the house, and the efficiency tabs have the traditional energy efficiency features here. And what you see here is an energy efficiency EDR, a PV and demand flexibility EDR, and then once you combine these two, you get a final EDR. So these are the targets that the building will have to meet. And in this building, this is a ZNE or almost a ZNE building that I modeled. You know, it meets all three targets. And we end up with a final EDR score of 3, which is slightly short of full ZNE of 0. For all-electric homes, even though the all-electric homes have a bigger kilowatt-hour load on annual basis, the PV requirement is actually based on the mixed-fuel home, which is that same 3 kilowatt PV system. And the reason we did that was, you know, we like to encourage all-electric homes. But if you wanted to double the size of the PV system, that would increase the cost of all-electric homes by about $10,000. And we thought that would become a disincentive to go all-electric. So we kept the requirements the same. And again, this is just a code minimum requirement. If the builder and the homeowner wish to add more PV systems, they can do that. So with the emergence of PV system and you know, and all electric homes actually provide a real opportunity to reduce the CO2 emissions from the house. So both the heat pump technology, both space heating and water heating, and the PV system make all electric home a real attractive option. But we've actually had a lot of people suggest that, well, you know, if you have a PV system up on the roof, why not put electric resistance for space heating or water heating? As if with a PV system, electricity is now too cheap to meter. But we don't agree with that. You know, we think the PV systems are still fairly expensive, and we need to encourage more efficient technologies, such as heat pump water heating. And currently, the NEA Tier 3 heat pump water heaters can comply in our standards in an all-electric package, along with heat pump space heating. And I'll have some slides later on that shows the benefits of this approach. So what are the PV sizes that we're talking about? You know, we reviewed the market data, and the current practice of installing PVs on existing homes, the average size is about 7.2 kilowatts. So these are PV systems that are going on existing homes that are older homes. However, for the 2019 standards compliant home, all you need is a PV system of about 2.8 kilowatts. So we think, you know, this approach of having a smaller PV system that's grid harmonized can actually bring greater benefit to the grid and the homeowner than a larger PV system that it may be out of sync with the grid. So that's point number one. Now, what are the typical PV sizes in the state? We have 16 climate zones here, and you can take your favorite climate zones. These are the EDR score. This is based on energy efficiency only. This is the EDR score based on energy efficiency and the PV system. For instance, in Sacramento, California, the EDR for energy efficiency is 43. The final EDR is 24, and the PV system that's required to get to that target is 3.1. And as you can see, the size doesn't change much from climate zone to climate zone, except for climate zone 15, which is the Palm Desert. That's our hottest climate zone. One of the questions we keep getting is, the Energy Commission estimated that the cost of the PV system installed would be about $3 a watt by 2020. And so there was a lot of questions from the public if that cost is correct or not. So we looked at 3 different sources of data. The first one was our own NSHP. And what you have here is the year. The second number is the number of PV systems installed. And then you have here the medium size of the PV system, the average size of the PV system, the median cost of the PV system, and here is the average cost. So we think the best metric to use is actually the median, because the median cost is less susceptible to price extremes on both high and low end. But again, if you want to use average, that's fine. And you can see that, by 2018, we've already are very close to that target. The other thing that this graph shows that the price of the PV system is continuing its downward trend very significantly, no matter which metric you use. We also looked at NREL's, that's the National Renewable Energy Lab. They track cost of PV system, and they estimated in Q1 of 2017, the installed cost of the PV system was $2.80. And Solar Energy Industry Association, SEIA, they also tracked these costs, and they reported the estimate cost of $2.94 in Q4 of 2017. So all of these, they kind of converge, and they support the notion that the $3 is the right number for 2020. So what about emissions, impact on emissions? So, as I mentioned, our software actually can produce these reports. And here's the summary. This is an existing home, a year 2000 compliant building. A mixed fuel home has gas and electricity. And that can generate about 6.5 metric tons of carbon a year. A more modern 2016 with no PV drops that by half to around 3.3. A 2019 compliant home with a 3 kilowatt PV system drops the CO2 generation to 2.1. And once we get to the all-electric region, you can see the real benefits, that the CO2 is really dropping to levels that, in one case, here's the 2019 standards with 6 kilowatt PV system battery storage. We're actually very close to 0 emissions from this house. Now, this is not part of the building standards. I just think it's a fun graph to look at. And what it does is combines the building standards with transportation. What happens if you have an older home, a 15-year-old home, with 2 10-year-old gasoline cars? How much CO2 are we generating? Again, keep in mind these are average, statewide average. We're talking about an average home and 2 average cars, an average family driving average miles per year. So if that's the case, this home and the cars generate about 19 metric tons of carbon a year. And as we go more towards more efficient buildings and EVs, these numbers can significantly drop. And in the best case, this is an all-electric home with 2019 compliant building features, an 8 kilowatt PV system with battery storage and 2 EVs, and we're down to 1 metric tons from an original about 19. We also have REACH codes in the state, as I mentioned, and local jurisdictions can specify targets that are more aggressive. There are generally 2 tiers. Tier 1 is generally halfway between the base code and the final. We have, again, 16 climate zones, but I've only represented 2 climate zones here, Sacramento and San Francisco. And in both cases, the base code EDR is between 23 and 25. The tier 1 target is going to be around here, and the final tier is going to be full Z&E. And builders can get to these targets by using either more energy efficiency, a larger PV system that's coupled with at least 5 kilowatt hours battery storage system. And again, they need to use our software to demonstrate compliance with these targets. This graph shows the CO2 emissions from the house by building loads. This is very interesting. Again, this is a 2,700 square foot home in Sacramento. For those of you who are not familiar, we have very hot summers. Temperatures above 100 are common. We also have fairly, I would say not cold, but cool winters. I mean, freezing temperatures are not uncommon in the winter here. Even so, when we look at what contributes most to the CO2 emissions, our biggest load now is the plug loads. And plug loads here are defined as anything that you plug in, your computers, your TV, your entertainment center. But this also includes all the appliances, refrigerator, washer, dryer, and also includes the lighting, both interior and exterior. The cooling load is actually this tiny sliver here. And the heating load, the space heating load, is large because this is all served by natural gas. So even so, the plug load is the biggest dominant load, and another major load is water heating. This is a mixed fuel home. What happens if you go to an all-electric home? It's this next graph. Look at what happens to the plug loads. Now they become the definitely dominant load. The space cooling load didn't change much. Water heating load gets a lot smaller because now instead of a gas water heater, we're using an electric water heater. Same thing with space heating. Very interesting result. Now, I showed a version of this graph that used energy to plot this. Now, this graph is using CO2 emissions. It's exactly the same as before. We have two scenarios, one with battery, without battery, and one with battery. And ironically, the two graphs actually look strikingly similar, which kind of says, saving energy and saving CO2 goes hand in hand. The two are actually, aligned. They're not incompatible. What's interesting here is this is an all-electric home. For most of the day, it's generating no CO2 at all, except, again, this is an August day, August 6th. In the winter, it's going to look different. But on this day, what you have here is a little CO2 emission from the house, and that's because in the morning, before the sun comes up, people are taking showers, and the heat pump water heater is using electricity from the grid. So other than that, the house is actually invisible and generating zero CO2. So this slide kind of summarizes the energy savings and cost savings from the standards. 30-year average cost of $9,500 and savings of $19,000 over 30 years. A monthly mortgage increase of $45, but a bill reduction of $80. Energy savings 7% without the PVs and 53% with PVs. And for the entire standards that included non-residential lighting, the standards saved over 480 gigawatt hours in the first year only. And that's enough CO2 savings, so that's enough electricity savings to generate about 250,000 cars.
Hey, Mazi, this is Warren. I hate to interrupt, but I just want to tell you to make sure we have time for questions. You should wrap up in 5 minutes.
Okay, I think these are my last slides. One of the questions we get, and I think this is an important policy question, is that the utility scale PV systems are are a lot cheaper than on-site PV systems. So why not use utility scale PV systems to achieve your policy goals? It's a fair question. Response is that the state is pursuing several energy and environmental policies simultaneously, including reducing GHG emissions from all sectors, including buildings and transportation, maintaining grid reliability and resilience, and also achieving cost-effective building energy standards. To achieve these policies, we need to be looking at all options available, both utility scales and on-site PV systems. Each have their opportunities and benefits, and each serves a special need. For instance, when we look at the PV scale utility system, these systems could be up to 500 megawatts or larger, and they are they are indeed the least costly when it comes to equipment cost of about $1 to $1.20 per watt, and they do reduce CO2 emissions system-wide. However, the challenges include they require very large land acquisition. Some of these central power systems, they can be up to 6 or 8 square miles. They require long transmission, distribution, and transformer infrastructure development. They may negatively impact sensitive creature habits. Actually, this is not a hypothetical situation. This is a real debate that we've had for some of these developments. And they also require very time-consuming and expensive environmental impact reports. So you cannot just focus on the first cost. You need to consider the entire consequences of this strategy. The rooftop systems, on the other hand, they are more costly. As we mentioned, they cost about $3 per watt, but the advantages are there's no land acquisition. The roof is already there. It's sunk cost. You can put in PV system at no additional cost. There are no additional transmission, distribution, or infrastructure needed, or very little compared to central stations. They do contribute to CO2 emission reductions, as I mentioned before, and they don't require an EIR, environmental impact report. Additionally, when PV systems are coupled with grid harmonization strategies, battery storage, demand responsive, they provide grid reliability and grid resilience benefits. It was interesting, the chairman of the CalISO was here last week, and he talked about some of these benefits, which I've included here. It's improve ancillary services, frequency and voltage regulation. Trying to do this on a system-wide basis is more challenging because what happens in Las Vegas impacts what happens in San Francisco, whereas these local microgrids, they're more isolated. Improved response to the dot curve and evening ramp. This evening ramp is very important for ISO, and I mentioned in previous graphs, these microgrids with grid harmonization, they smooth things out. Improved reliability during grid failures, such as natural disasters and wildfires. And also, these microgrids are less prone to cyber attacks. And also, on-site PV systems save significant money for the building occupants, making home ownership more affordable. For the future, this is important. We're moving away from the Z&E towards CO2 emission metrics. So for the 2022 cycle and beyond, we will not be talking much about Z&E anymore. We're going to be talking about strategies that will get us to very low carbon emissions. And so that's going to be our primary focus. And also we'll be focusing more on non-residential buildings because up to this point, most of our focus on residential buildings. I'm just going to thumb through these screens. These are some of the capabilities of CBEC software that we've created. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to describe them, just to tell you that these capabilities exist, and this software is available for free to everyone on the planet. And these are some of the references that I've included for you. The standards document, the joint appendices where JA11 and 12 reside, the compliance manuals that describe how to comply with the standards in layman terms. This is where you can download feedback res. If you have any questions, feel free to send me or Danny an email. So with that, I turn it over to Warren.
Hey, thanks very much. That was a great presentation. We have about 15 to close to 20 minutes for questions, so I will go through some of the questions we've received. One person wrote in to ask whether there was any thought when it came to storage to thinking about electric water heaters or other water heaters as thermal energy storage devices that would be encouraged under the standards.
Yes, I will let Danny Tam to answer that question.
Yeah, we recognize the thermal storage benefits of water heating. So we're working with NRDC to develop a DR credit for heat pump water heater. So that should be available in the future. Also, there's a pre-cooling credit that you can take in the software. So the idea is, since we're building the house so tight that you can store cooling energy, so you can pre-cool the house, when there's excess solar production. So that'll help the house coast through the peak hours of the day.
Thank you. And someone wrote in to ask, you've said you want to size the PV system so they don't exceed the annual house consumption. How are you addressing or enabling possible future expansion in load to deal with things such as a homeowner wants to get an electric vehicle?
Very good question. Recall that standards are the minimum required PV system, and we base that minimum size on the NEM criteria, which makes a PV system that offsets the annual kilowatt hour the most cost-effective option. However, if the homeowner anticipates that they're going to have EVs, they can actually talk to their local utility or the builder, and they can install additional PV system. It's just that we're not requiring it, but the option is definitely there, and we're not in any shape or form preventing or prohibiting that practice. Then it becomes a choice between the homeowner and their builder and the utility, as it is today.
Okay. Under the all-electric home model, what technology are you assuming will be used to satisfy the thermal load of the building?
So the thermal loads of the buildings are the space heating, space cooling, and water heating. And all three of them can be satisfied with the heat pump technology. And this heat pump, to my surprise, I switched my own gas water heater to heat pump water heater. I love it. I mean, it works really good. I get hot water on demand. I can monitor the load. I can control it with my phone. When it heats and when it's not, and it's there. It does the job quietly. I don't even notice. Same thing with the heat pump water heating, space heating. On the cooling side, it's not any different than your regular air conditioning. On the heating side, there's been a lot of improvement in operation and efficiency. It does become occasionally a matter of homeowner's choice. Some people like the warmer air that comes out of a gas furnace, but the heat pump water heater certainly does the job. And on the appliance side, it's the biggest load would be the electric clothes dryer, but they're also coming up with a heat pump water heater version of that. And the other one would be the stove, the cooking. There's some people have preference for gas. But this induction stoves are also becoming very popular. So there is a counter electric part that's very attractive and cost effective for every gas version appliance that's out there.
Thank you. Back in slide 25, you had data on the annual CO2 production from different types of homes. What did you use as the data source for this, to determine those numbers?
What was it used?
One with your car.
Yeah, 25. Can I advance that slide? I had two of them. So the question is how we generated those numbers. Is that what the question was?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think they took the controls away from. So what it is again we have.
So Sam, excuse me, Sam, could you go to slide 25?
So we've developed the software called CBAC Res, and the CBAC Res in there you model your building with the features that it has, building envelope. Yeah, so you model the building with the features that it has, and then the older buildings are going to have less insulation, they're going to have poorer windows, and the 2019 compliant windows or buildings have better envelope features appliances. So that's number one. The other one is that is the CO2 emissions from the cars. For here, I actually have all the assumptions, and I can send it to you if you send me an email. But if I recall correctly, these are electric cars that have 18 miles per gallon. And I used conversion, and I think I used national miles per driven. I think it's about 14,000 miles per year. And so you apply some conversions factor based on the 18 miles per gallon. And there's also, I think each gallon of gas produces about 20 kilograms of CO2 or 20 pounds or 9 kilograms of CO2. So I have all the assumptions in a spreadsheet, and that's what I use. It's all published data. So based on results of the CBAC Res for homes and simulations for the cars.
Thank you. You know, a minute or two ago, you were talking about heat pumps. Were you talking exclusively about air source heat pumps, or are you also assuming that some homes will use ground source heat pumps?
The assumption in the standard is the air source heat pump, but you can also model ground source heat pump in the software, which would give you more benefit.
It gives you more benefit, more savings, less CO2 emissions.
Okay, thank you. This question I think you answered, but just so there's no confusion on people's part, someone asked, do the standards require that the solar panels be installed during the construction of the new homes, or just that the other components of the PV system be installed and the panels can come later?
No, they have to be installed at the time of final inspection. So we use the permitting process and building inspection process by local jurisdictions to enforce the standards. So prior to the final inspection, all building systems need to be there, and they need to meet the standards requirement. That includes all efficiency features and all PV system, inverters, and if they've claimed credit for battery storage, it must have the battery storage, so all up and running according to the standard specifications.
So you talked about community solar as potentially in the future being an option. One of our listeners asked, has there been any consideration of community energy storage that homeowners could in effect buy into?
So Bill Pennington will answer this question.
Yes, the option that we've created with rules for the Energy Commission to approve community resources includes the possibility of storage as a community resource.
Thank you.
One thing I'd like to mention before I forget, we're also working on a series of questions and answers. It's a document that's going to be very helpful that actually answers many of these questions. When we adopted the standards, there was a really big interest in what we did, and there was a lot of feedback we got, many of them good, some of them critical. So these Q&As were developed to respond to those questions. We were probably going to put them online on our website next week. I would send a link to Warren, and he can forward to the group, and I think you will find a lot of useful information in there. Sorry for that.
Yes.
Go ahead.
No, that's good. When you send that, we'll send that out to everybody who registered for this webinar. I want to go back right to the beginning of the webinar, where you were talking about the new solar home partnership, and you were saying it was a significant success. One person asked, given that was such a success, why isn't it being continued and extended?
So this is Bill Penning. I was anticipating a slightly different question. The whole approach that has ended up with these building standards having solar really originated or was coincident with SB1 that created the program, the NSHP program, and other solar incentives programs. And part of that legislation anticipated the potential for solar to become part of the building code. So anyway, all of this stuff hangs together going way back. Maybe I'll ask Kevin to answer the question about why is the NSHP program being discontinued.
Hi, this is Kevin. So originally the NSHP program was developed to help a technology that was in its infancy. With the way that we're forecasting, and as seen in Mozzie's PowerPoint, the technology of PV has developed to the point to where it's becoming self-sustaining, and NSHP has achieved its goals in that regards. And that's why NSHP is being ended. In addition to that, it's also written in the Senate bill that the program, also during a ruling a couple years done back by the CPUC, that the program is set to end in 2018, so we don't take any new reservations after that period. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah.
You had data in the presentation relatively early on around the median cost per watt of a PV system in California. Do you have a sense about how those costs compare to other parts of the country?
Yeah, they're not that much different. California costs are a little bit higher. Again, the NREL and the Solar Industry Association, the numbers were national. NSHP was California. California costs are a little bit higher because our labor costs are a little bit higher, but it's only a few cents. It's not. I actually looked at. I have another graph that compares California with New Jersey and New York and Massachusetts. Some of the other ones, we're about 5, 6, 7, 8 cents higher, but not drastically higher.
Cents per what?
Cents per kilowatt. So like California's might be $2.94 per watt. New Jersey's might be $2.90, like 4 cents cheaper. It's not hugely different.
Okay, thank you. In California, there's a program that provides rebates for multifamily affordable housing for existing buildings, for PV on multifamily affordable housing. Given that PV will now be required to be installed during construction on affordable housing, do you envision any special incentives for that market?
So I'm not aware of any conversation going on about that right now. It's a good question, and potentially something would happen there, but I'm not aware of a dialogue going on about that right now.
And one person wants to know about wood heat, whether that's something that's encouraged or discouraged in California.
So we've had standards here for about 40 years, and wood heating has been an option throughout that whole time. There are some limitations on, where you get your wood source and so forth, but that's not ruled out.
Thank you.
But if you switch to a CO2 metric, it becomes, in my opinion, harder for wood heating to comply. It depends on where the source of the wood is, I suppose.
Good. Well, we only have a few minutes left, and I'm going to ask one last question that'll have two parts. The first part is there anything that you want to say to the audience that you haven't had a chance to say? And second, connected to that, if you had a couple of messages for policymakers in other parts of the country who want to do something similar to what California has done, what are a couple of really good pieces of advice for that?
I'm going to say a few words, but I'm going to ask Bill to chime in too. I think our approach of making building energy efficiency the top priority, that was definitely the right thing to do. We've been able to reduce the energy consumption of our homes by upwards of 80% compared to the existing home stock. So that definitely was an effort. We've worked hard with builders to introduce the concept of high-performance attics and walls, and many of these builders are national builders. Once they learn that in California, there's no reason why they couldn't do it in Arizona, Nevada, Texas, Utah. It's going to be easier to do it, and it's going to work just as well. Another thing we're working to make windows very efficient. We're working with some national builders and some national labs, and that also going to spill into other states. So building energy efficiency first. If you want to do it, use our experience, what we've developed, use the tools, work with these builders. You can probably do the same thing in your states too. Right-sizing the PV system was the right thing for us to do. Each state is going to have its own NEM rules, net energy metering rules, so I can't speak for all of them, but in this state, keeping the PV size small, right size, but making it grid harmonized is definitely the right thing to do. That helps the grid, it helps the homeowner. So if you want to do that, again, use what we've developed and our experience, and you can do that. Bill, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say that, California has had, 40 years of experience here in focusing heavily on energy efficiency reductions. But our mandate, going back to the beginning, was to make sure that the demand that newly constructed buildings have on the state's energy systems is well controlled. I mean, there's obviously been an expectation that the population of the state would be growing over that time period vigorously, and every new building that's added to accommodate that growth and house that growth is a new impact on the grid and on the gas system. And so from the get-go, we were not only talking about energy efficiency, but we also were looking at solar options, passive solar or active solar systems, as they became cost effective and available. So it was natural for us to sort of at the end of the line here, after years and years and years of emphasis on energy efficiency, to add PVs to continue to lower that demand. The result is that California has jumped way ahead of the other states in terms of the lowering the demand of our buildings, our residences, on our state resources, and we think that's huge. And it also has lowered our carbon footprint for our homes dramatically compared to other states as well. And so we think it's a completely well-reasoned approach. We worked hard with the builders to figure it out. Right sizing is absolutely critical. PVs being put onto these homes is the right thing to do from the vantage point of addressing the intermittency of utility renewable resources and having demand flexibility so that actually each home can contribute to accommodating high levels of renewables on the grid is really important. We're trying to push for the smartest inverters that are available in combination, and we see battery storage as technology that's coming. So the combination of PVs, very low energy use due to energy efficiency, battery storage, just creates a big opportunity for the homes to be to provide demand flexibility services that limits their impact and even creates benefits for the grid. And so we think this is an extremely important thing to do, and we encourage other states to look at it.
If I may add one more point, the process that we use to adopt the standards is a very inclusive and open and collaborative process, and that was the key to our success. We work very closely with all builders and their representatives, solar industry, utilities, environmental groups, and the result was a set of standards that was unanimously supported by everyone involved. That in itself was a big achievement. So, if you want to do this in your state, it's really important to have that approach, to work collaboratively with all the different stakeholders.
Hey, I want to thank you very much, all of you at the California Energy Commission, for an excellent webinar, and even more for the leadership the California Energy Commission has been showing in developing the building energy efficiency standards. And it's going to obviously have a big impact, not just in California, but is going to influence states across the country. Finally, I want to thank all of you who listened to this webinar for joining us, and I hope you will join us for future webinars. Go to our website, www.cisa.org, to learn about our organization and to get on our mailing list so you'll know about future webinars. Thank you very much.